For most of his career, Simon Cowell was known as the man who didn't flinch, the judge who could dismantle a performance with a single sentence, the face that rarely softened, the voice that rarely hesitated. Audiences expected honesty from him, but not warmth. They tuned in for sharp critiques, uncomfortable pauses, and the kind of brutal clarity that made or broke dreams in seconds. That was the image. That was the identity. And for a long time, it never seemed like it would change. But then, slowly, something shifted. At first, it was subtle, a pause that lasted a little longer than usual, a comment that felt more thoughtful than cutting, a moment where his expression didn't match the words people were used to hearing. It wasn't enough to make headlines immediately, but it was enough for people to notice. Because when someone builds a reputation as strong as Simon's, even the smallest change feels significant. And then came the whispers, not loud at first, just quiet speculation, passed from one person to another, growing as it moved. People began asking questions. Why did he seem different? Why did he look more emotional? Why did moments that once wouldn't have affected him now seem to linger? The internet, as it often does, filled in the gaps with its own answers. And those answers weren't always grounded in truth. One particular narrative began to take hold. It was emotional. It was dramatic. And most importantly, it was believable enough to spread. The story suggested that something deeply personal had happened behind the scenes. Something involving his son. Something serious. Something that could explain the visible change in a man who once seemed almost untouchable. The idea spread quickly, fueled by edited clips, emotional music, and carefully chosen moments that painted a very specific picture. In those clips, Simon looked quieter, more reflective, sometimes even close to tears. To someone watching without context, it felt like evidence, proof that something must be wrong, proof that there was a deeper story waiting to be uncovered. But here's the thing about narratives built online. They don't need to be true to feel real. They just need to connect enough dots to seem convincing. And in this case, the dots were never as connected as they appeared. Because behind all the speculation, behind all the assumptions, there was a much more grounded reality. One that didn't rely on hidden tragedies or secret diagnoses. One that didn't involve a dramatic reveal. Instead, it was built on something quieter, something far more human, a gradual shift that had been happening over time, shaped by experiences that never needed to be turned into headlines. The truth is, the change people were seeing didn't come from a single moment. It came from many. Becoming a father was one of them, not in the dramatic way people often imagine, but in a steady, undeniable way that reshapes how someone sees the world. When you go from being responsible only for yourself to being responsible for someone else, everything adjusts. Priorities move. Time feels different. The things that once seemed urgent suddenly don't carry the same weight. For Simon, that shift didn't happen overnight. It unfolded slowly. At first, it showed up in small choices. Spending more time at home. Stepping away from work earlier than he used to. Paying attention to moments that would have once passed unnoticed. None of these changes were dramatic on their own. But together, they began to form a new version of him. And that version didn't align with the image people had known for years. At the same time, there were other moments that didn't involve his family directly but still left a mark. Encounters with people whose stories carried weight. Performers who walked onto a stage not just with talent, but with struggles, challenges, and realities that couldn't be ignored. These weren't just performances anymore. They were glimpses into lives that demanded attention in a different way. And when you start to see those moments differently, you start to respond differently too. There's something powerful about witnessing someone fight through something difficult. It has a way of cutting through everything else. It makes you stop. It makes you listen. And sometimes, it makes you feel something you weren't expecting. For someone like Simon, who had spent years separating emotion from judgment, those moments began to carry more weight than before. Not because he suddenly became a different person overnight, but because something inside him had opened up, a perspective that hadn't been there in the same way before. And once that perspective is there, it doesn't go away. So when people saw him reacting differently, when they noticed the emotion in his expressions, they tried to find a reason that matched the intensity of what they were seeing. They looked for something dramatic, something hidden, something that could explain it all at once. But the real explanation wasn't dramatic. It was layered. It was a result of years of living one way, followed by the realization that maybe that way wasn't sustainable forever. It was a result of understanding that success, while valuable, doesn't replace time. It was a result of recognizing that being present in your own life matters just as much as building something impressive. And perhaps most importantly, it was a result of allowing himself to feel things he had spent years pushing aside. That's not something that happens easily. When someone builds an identity around control, precision, and distance, stepping away from that, even slightly, can feel unfamiliar. It can feel uncomfortable. It can feel like losing a part of yourself. But it can also feel like gaining something you didn't realize you were missing. For Simon, that gain showed up in ways people could see, even if they didn't fully understand them. It showed up in the way he listened more carefully, in the way he chose his words with more consideration, in the way he allowed moments to breathe instead of cutting them short. These weren't signs of weakness. They were signs of awareness. And awareness changes everything. It changes how you react. It changes how you connect. It changes how you see the people in front of you. Suddenly, they're not just performers or contestants. They're individuals with stories that matter. And responding to those stories with empathy doesn't take away from honesty. It adds to it. That's the part that often gets misunderstood. People assume that being softer means being less truthful, that being emotional means losing clarity. But in reality, it often means the opposite. It means understanding the full picture instead of just one part of it. It means recognizing that there's more to a moment than what's immediately visible. And when you reach that point, you don't go back. That's why the idea of an emotional goodbye became such a compelling narrative. Because in a way, there was a goodbye happening, but not in the way people thought. It wasn't goodbye to someone. It wasn't a response to a hidden tragedy. It was a goodbye to a version of himself that no longer fit the life he was living. The version that thrived on constant pressure. The version that pushed through exhaustion without stopping. The version that measured success only in terms of outcomes, not experiences. Letting go of that version isn't easy. It requires acknowledging that something needs to change. It requires choosing a different path, even when the old one is familiar. And it requires accepting that growth doesn't always look the way people expect it to. But when it happens, it's noticeable. That's what people were seeing. Not a man breaking down, but a man opening up. Not a story of hidden suffering, but a story of visible change. Not a reaction to something tragic, but a response to something transformative. And transformation doesn't need a headline to be real. It happens in the quiet moments, in the decisions no one else sees, in the realization that the life you built might need to be adjusted, not abandoned, but reshaped into something that feels more balanced. For Simon, that balance seems to have become the focus, still involved in the work that defined him, but no longer consumed by it, still present in the industry he helped shape, but not at the cost of everything else, still recognizable as a person people have watched for years, but clearly evolving into something more. That evolution is what people were trying to explain when they created their own narratives. They just chose the wrong explanation, because the real story doesn't rely on mystery. It doesn't depend on speculation. It doesn't need to be exaggerated to feel meaningful. It's already meaningful in its simplest form. It's about change. The kind that happens when someone decides to live differently. The kind that comes from experience, not assumption. The kind that doesn't ask for attention but ends up receiving it anyway, because it's genuine. And maybe that's why it resonated with so many people, even if they misunderstood it at first, because at its core it reflects something universal. The idea that no matter how established someone is, no matter how fixed their identity seems, there's always a possibility of growth. There's always room for a shift in perspective. There's always a moment where someone looks at their life and decides to adjust it in a way that feels more aligned with who they are becoming. That's not a sign of something going wrong. It's a sign of something going right. And once you see it that way, the entire story changes. It's no longer about a hidden diagnosis or a dramatic goodbye. It's about a visible transformation, one that doesn't need to be explained through speculation because it can be understood through observation. A man who once seemed emotionally distant allowed himself to be present. A life once driven entirely by work making space for something more personal. A reputation built on sharpness, softening into something more balanced. Not because he had to, but because he chose to. And that choice is what makes the story real.